October 25th, 1944, just before dawn, off the eastern edge of Samar Island. The sea is uneasy but calm enough to deceive. Low clouds hang close to the water. Engines hum at cruising speed. On the decks of small American ships, sailors are finishing breakfast, unaware that the horizon has already changed. Then the flashes appear. Orange blooms far away at first. Seconds later, the sound arrives. Deep, rolling thunder, not from the sky, but from the sea itself. Battleship guns. A radar contact resolves into shapes that should not be here. Towering silhouettes, heavy cruisers, battleships, the largest surface force Japan can still assemble. One small American escort turns toward them. Its hull is thin. Its guns are light. Its orders were never meant for this kind of fight. But as the range closes, hesitation disappears. The bow cuts into the swell. This was not supposed to be a battleship battle, and yet it had already begun. Mid-October 1944, the Philippines become the hinge of the Pacific War. On 20th October, American troops go ashore on Leyte, beginning the return to a chain of islands that Japan had turned into a defensive wall. For Washington, Leyte is more than territory. It is a severing point, cutting Japan from oil, rubber, and raw materials flowing from the south. For Tokyo, it is the moment the war threatens to become irreversible. Japan answers with a plan built on its remaining surface fleet, Operation Show, a last-ditch attempt to draw American naval strength into confusion and then strike the vulnerable invasion shipping. The concept is brutal in its simplicity. Divert fast carrier forces to pull attention away, while a powerful battleship and cruiser formation, Kurita's center force, pushes through the San Bernardino Strait and descends on Leyte Gulf. But on the American side of that equation sits a different kind of naval power, small, utilitarian, and designed for a war that has already changed. Off Samar, the 7th Fleet deploys escort carrier groups known by their radio call signs Taffy 1, Taffy 2, Taffy 3. These are not fast fleet carriers. They are jeep carriers, slower and lightly built, carrying aircraft meant for close air support, anti-submarine patrols, and keeping local skies clean over the beachheads. Their daily work is routine and relentless, launching strikes over eastern Leyte, hitting airfields, roads, and supply routes, then recovering planes again and again as the invasion expands. Taffy 3, under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, is one of those groups. Its screen is thin, a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts, ships built to hunt submarines and guard convoys, not to duel battleships at gun range. And yet, in the dark hours before dawn on 25th October, while those escort carriers are still committed to supporting soldiers ashore, an unseen surface force begins to slide out of the strait behind them, bringing a kind of firepower the men of Taffy 3 were never supposed to face. At 0637, the illusion of safety breaks. Lookouts on the escort carriers report shapes on the northern horizon, tall masts, pagoda superstructures, silhouettes that do not belong to destroyers. Almost immediately, water columns erupt nearby. Shells land short, then long, then closer. The ranging shots are deliberate, professional, battleship gunnery. What emerges from the morning haze is Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, including Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It is a surface fleet assembled for annihilation, now unexpectedly behind the American lines. The tactical imbalance is extreme. Taffy 3's escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, Gambier Bay, Kalinin Bay, Kitkoon Bay, White Plains, and St. Lo, make barely 18 knots at best. Their decks carry aircraft armed mostly with bombs and rockets for land targets, not armor-piercing weapons meant for capital ships. Their escorts, USS Johnston, USS Hole, USS Heermann, and destroyer escorts like USS Samuel B. Roberts are lightly armored, thin-skinned, and hopelessly outgunned. Rear Admiral Sprague understands the reality instantly. There is no time to regroup, no larger force coming over the horizon. His only options are movement, smoke, and aggression. Orders go out in rapid sequence. Escort carriers turn south and east, laying smoke, launching every aircraft that can fly, armed or not. Destroyers increase speed and begin aggressive maneuvers directly toward the Japanese line. Torpedo attacks are ordered not to destroy the enemy outright, but to force battleships to turn, to disrupt firing solutions, to buy minutes. Those minutes matter. Every degree of turn, every shell dodged, every salvo thrown off target keeps the carriers alive a little longer. But the Japanese guns keep firing. 8-inch cruiser shells begin finding targets. Battleship salvos straddle the fleeing carriers. One escort carrier is hit, then another. What follows is not a coordinated fleet engagement. It is a series of desperate, overlapping actions. Small ships charging through shell fire, pilots attacking without proper weapons, and officers making decisions that accept loss as the price of delay. And in that chaos, one of the smallest ships in the formation receives its orders, then turns directly toward the largest guns afloat. Human angle. Small ship, big horizon. On a destroyer escort like USS Samuel B. Roberts, the war is usually measured in sonar pings and convoy lanes. A ship this size is built to protect others. Thin steel, compact machinery, a crew packed tight into narrow compartments. It is not designed to stand in the open and trade fire with cruisers and battleships. But off Samar, the men aboard do not have the luxury of choosing the scale of the fight. The first sensations are physical. The deck vibration as the ship accelerates. The metallic taste of cordite as the guns begin firing. The sound of incoming shells, sometimes heard as a tearing rush, sometimes only felt as shock waves punching the air. Fear is present, but it is absorbed into procedure. Gun crews feed ammunition with hands that must not shake. The bridge watches the sea and calculates angles while spray and smoke smear the view. Damage control parties wait below, not hoping to avoid being hit, but preparing for the moment it happens. In the distance, the escort carriers, slow, vulnerable, turning away under smoke, are not abstract symbols. They are friends. They are the mission. If the screen collapses, those carriers are slaughtered. Everyone aboard knows it without being told. Tactical angle. Delay is the weapon. Taffy 3's escorts do not have the firepower to win in a conventional sense. What they have is initiative. A torpedo run forces a cruiser to turn. A smoke screen breaks optical tracking. A sudden burst of gunfire distracts a ship that should be aiming at the carriers. These actions do not destroy the center force. They dislocate it. The destroyers and destroyer escorts begin acting like a swarm, attacking from different bearings, creating overlapping threats. Even when shells miss, the splash patterns and near straddles create a constant problem for Japanese gunners. Firing solutions must be recalculated again and again as targets zigzag, vanish behind smoke, then reappear at closer range. Sprague's carriers launch aircraft in waves, not as a decisive strike, but as harassment. Bombs, rockets, even depth charges if that is what is available. Anything that forces a Japanese ship to maneuver, to shift fire, to lose tempo, buys a few more minutes of separation. In this fight, time is not a background factor. It is the central currency. And to spend that currency, the screen does something almost unimaginable. It moves toward the heavy guns, closing distance so that torpedoes can reach, so that smoke can obscure, so that the enemy's clean battle plan collapses into a mess of evasive turns and scattered targets. The sea fills with smoke and spray. The range compresses, and the next angle of the battle begins where steel meets engineering, where the limitations of equipment become the difference between escape and extinction. Technological angle, improvisation under a battleship's shadow. The aircraft lifting off Taffy 3's decks are not configured for hunting battleships. Many carry general-purpose bombs, rockets, or depth charges, weapons meant for ground targets or submarines, pressed into an emergency role because there is no alternative. Pilots attack anyway, diving through flak and cloud breaks, aiming for vulnerable places. A cruiser's bridge, a destroyer's stern, the thin skin around guns and directors. Even when the damage is limited, every run forces Japanese ships to maneuver, to throw off aim, to lose rhythm. On the surface, the American screen depends on tools that are simple but decisive in this moment. Smoke becomes armor. Chemical generators and stacks lay curtains across the sea, stripping Japanese gunnery of clear optics. Radar can help, but in squalls and smoke, the engagement becomes fractured. Targets appear and vanish, and even massive ships must react to what they can confirm. And then there are torpedoes, the one weapon that can make a battleship respect a small ship. A torpedo threat does not need a hit to change a battle. It demands a turn. A turn breaks a firing solution. A turn opens gaps in formation. In a surface action that should be decided by heavy guns, the smallest ships carry a lever that can pry the enemy line out of shape. Leadership, Bach's moral angle, the decision to close. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague is not commanding a battle line. He is commanding survival, choosing to run while ordering attacks that look, on paper, irrational. The escort commanders understand the intent immediately. If the carriers live, the mission lives. If the carriers die, nothing else matters. So captains commit ships built for escort duty into a gunfight against cruisers and battleships. It is not romantic. It is arithmetic. A destroyer escort like USS Samuel B cannot absorb heavy caliber hits for long. Everyone aboard knows the ship is expendable in the cold logic of the situation. Yet the crew still drives it forward because retreat would not save them. It would only ensure the carriers are caught. The moral weight of the battle is carried in these choices: quiet, professional, and final. And as smoke thickens and the sea erupts with shell splashes, the tiny ship angles in, pushing past the point where turning back is even possible, because the next minutes will be decided at close range, under full enemy fire. The range collapses fast. Between smoke curtains, the Japanese line appears in fragments: gray hulls, tall superstructures, gun flashes that bloom and vanish behind cloud and haze. The water around Taffy 3 is suddenly alive with impacts. Near misses throw walls of seawater higher than a destroyer's bridge. Splinters of steel and spray sweep across open decks. On USS Samuel B. speed becomes a prayer answered by engineering. The ship pushes toward the gunfire, not because it can survive it, but because distance is worse. At long range, Japanese cruisers and battleships can pick off the escort carriers methodically. At closer range, torpedoes and confusion begin to matter. The destroyers ahead are already committed. USS Johnston drives in hard, taking heavy fire. USS Howell and USS Heermann maneuver through smoke and splashes, each run forcing the enemy to react. The screen is not a line anymore. It is a series of individual charges, overlapping threats, ships appearing out of smoke, firing, then disappearing again. The escort carriers are running south, launching aircraft as they flee. Flight decks stay busy even as shells land close enough to shutter the hulls. Planes lift off with whatever is available, climbing into low cloud, then turning back into the fire. Japanese heavy cruisers, armed with 8-inch guns, become the immediate killers. Their rate of fire is faster than battleships, their salvos walking in with grim precision. One escort carrier, USS Gambier Bay, begins taking hits that slow her further, making her the easiest target in the formation. Through this chaos, the tiny ship commits to the kind of approach that turns the sea into a funnel. Smoke streams past the bow. The bridge watches for torpedo range. The guns fire not to win a duel, but to keep enemy crews ducking, to disrupt directors, to make every Japanese ship feel threatened by something smaller than it wants to respect. And then the moment arrives where calculation ends. The ship is close enough now that a torpedo attack is possible. Close enough that every second brings either impact or opportunity. The sea is bright with shell splashes, the sky alive with aircraft, and the American escorts are running out of time to keep the carriers ahead alive. The next phase is decided not by distance, but by consequences, because the enemy begins landing hits, and the battle's momentum starts to pivot on what each side believes is happening around them. Smoke thins in places, then thickens again. Rain squalls slide across the sea like moving walls. Every gap becomes a window into something enormous. For USS Samuel B. the fight stops being abstract when the shapes resolve into individual ships. Heavy cruisers running parallel, their broadsides flashing in disciplined rhythm. The destroyer escort's captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, has already turned his ship into the attack without waiting for perfect conditions. What matters is a torpedo track that will force a turn, and a few minutes more for the carriers behind him. Over the ship's announcing circuit, Copeland tells the crew words that are remembered because they match what everyone can already see. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. At close range, Samuel B. Roberts tries to launch torpedoes into the Japanese formation, then takes damage that jams the mount, then recovers it again in the smoke. And when the cruiser Chikuma appears through rain and haze, firing into the escort carriers, Copeland shifts from stealth to violence. Permission to open fire is finally given. The destroyer escort's 5-inch gun begins hammering, a rapid, relentless rhythm against armor it was never meant to challenge. For long minutes, the ship stays in a close gunnery fight, firing hundreds of rounds, aiming at what it can hurt. Exposed crews, fire control positions, unarmored sections that keep a cruiser fighting. But the Japanese response is not one ship. It is a battlefield. Multicolored salvos begin bracketing the small escort. Shell splashes walking inward, the water itself seeming to rise and fall. The ship dodges like a living thing. Engines driven past normal limits to extract speed from machinery not built for this punishment. Then the hits begin to land. Cruiser shells tear into the ship's structure. Boilers are damaged. Speed falls. The deck fills with smoke that is no longer protective. Smoke that burns. At about 09 Sauker, Samuel B. Roberts is effectively knocked out of the fight, dead in the water, sinking, its role completed in the simplest currency of naval war, time purchased with steel and lives. And yet, the battle's momentum is already slipping away from the Japanese. Destroyer attacks have broken formations. Smoke and weather have obscured the carriers just enough. Aircraft, often poorly armed for armored ships, keep coming anyway, forcing turns, breaking aim, and feeding a growing Japanese uncertainty about what they are actually fighting. Kurita's flagship has already been forced into evasive maneuvers. Contact is fragmented. Reports suggest carriers, real carriers, might be near. And the longer he stays, the more he risks losing the remainder of Japan's surface fleet in a battle he can no longer control. At 0920, Kurita makes the decision that defines the day. He breaks off the engagement with the order, "All ships, my course north, speed 20." To the Americans still twisting through smoke and shell splashes, the change is felt before it is understood. The gunfire begins to thin. Then it shifts away. Then, suddenly, there is open water where a battleship line had been. For Taffy 3, survival is not victory in the triumphant sense. It is something narrower and more brutal. The carriers are still afloat, but the sea behind them is filling with men and wreckage, and the price of those minutes is now drifting in the wake. The Japanese guns fade into distance, but the sea does not become quiet. Smoke still hangs low over the water, drifting in torn sheets. Burning fuel leaves a bitter film on the wind. Between the swells, scattered. Wreckage rises and falls. Planks, floats, loose gear, small evidence of ships that were here minutes ago, now gone. For the men in the water, time stretches into something slow and merciless. Some cling to life rafts. Others grip floating debris until their hands fail. Oil stings eyes and coats mouths. Wounded sailors call out, then go silent, conserving breath. Every distant engine noise sounds like rescue, until it passes. Around them, the losses settle into hard facts. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, the small ship that drove into cruiser fire to disrupt the attack, has slipped under, leaving survivors scattered across the surface. The destroyers USS Hull and USS Johnston are gone as well, broken by shell fire after repeated charges that forced the Japanese to maneuver and lose coherence. And among the carriers, USS Gambier Bay, slowed by repeated hits, cannot outrun heavy cruisers. She takes the punishment meant for others and sinks into the same sea she had been, launching aircraft from hours earlier. The surviving ships of Taffy 3 are still moving, still working, because survival is not a single moment. It is a process. Destroyers and destroyer escorts turn back as soon as they can, searching through smoke and scattered squalls for men in the water, pulling survivors aboard, counting heads, treating burns, stopping bleeding with whatever hands and cloth are available. But even as rescue begins, the larger battle is not finished. The morning has already proven that the sea can change in an instant, and another threat is still circling above the horizon, waiting for a wounded force to slow down. The next threat does not arrive from the horizon. It falls out of the sky. As Taffy 3 counts survivors and steadies damaged ships, Japanese aircraft begin searching for anything slow, smoking, or separated. By late morning, the escort carrier USS St. Lo is struck by a kamikaze, an attack that turns a moving flight deck into a furnace. Flames spread fast, fed by aviation fuel and armed aircraft. Explosions follow. In the hours after the surface battle has ended, St. Lo is lost. One more carrier that had survived battleship salvos, only to die to a new kind of weapon. The ledger of the morning is brutal even before the air attack is added. In the fight off Samar, Taffy 3 loses the escort carrier. Gambier Bay, the destroyers, Johnston, and Hull, and the destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts, and many more ships carried damage, shrapnel scars, and wounded below decks. Japan, for all its tonnage and gunpowder, fails to reach the invasion transports at Leyte Gulf, the central purpose of its gamble. The larger consequence is not only tactical, it is psychological. Kurita's force has met a formation that should have been swept aside, and instead is met by smoke, torpedoes, relentless air harassment, and ships charging directly into the teeth of heavy guns. It changes what weak looks like in combat. It forces hesitation where the plan required certainty. And when Kurita breaks off, seeking to regroup a formation now scattered and under constant threat, Japan's last major surface thrust toward Leyte loses its moment. In the aftermath, words that survive are rarely dramatic. They are often professional, almost quiet. In a U.S. Navy history account drawing from Lieutenant Dr. Robert W. Copeland's after-action reflections, he would later write of his crew that there was no higher honor than the privilege to lead them into that fight. The sea off Samar keeps its wreckage. The war moves on. But the shape of what happened here doesn't fade, because it proved that a battle can be decided not by who brings the biggest guns, but by who refuses to let them be used. The morning off, Samar did not change the war with a new weapon or a brilliant maneuver. It changed it with refusal. Refusal to accept scale as destiny. Refusal to treat smaller ships as expendable abstractions. Refusal to let arithmetic alone decide who lives and who is erased. After Samar, the lesson is unmistakable. Battleships still carry immense power, but power that cannot be brought to bear, confused by smoke, disrupted by torpedoes, harassed by aircraft, loses its meaning. Sea control is no longer defined by armor thickness or gun caliber. It is defined by time, information, and the willingness to act inside uncertainty. For leadership, the battle leaves a quieter mark. Decisions made in minutes, by Sprague, by individual ship captains, by gun crews and engineers, carry consequences far beyond the men who make them. Samar shows that leadership in war is not always about victory. Sometimes it is about holding a line long enough for others to survive. And for history, the legacy endures in contrast. A fleet built around the largest battleship ever constructed is turned back by escort carriers, destroyers, and one tiny ship that charged forward knowing exactly what the odds meant. The officers who ordered a retreat did so because the battlefield no longer made sense, and because a handful of smaller ships had rewritten it. The sea closed over them. The carriers escaped. And the war, from that morning on, moved in only one direction,